I turn it over to Sas.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you, colleagues. It's a real privilege for me to be back here at OCMS. OCMS is still for me one of, I see, kind of my theological foundation. The whole understanding of transformational development and transformational theology played a leading role in my own theological development. So thank you very much, Tom, for this opportunity. As Tom said, I'm working for Tearfund. Tearfund is a Christian relief and development organization based in Teddington, but working in more than 50 countries, partnering specifically with the church to bring restoration to those living in poverty. Tearfund is quite unique in the sense that we have a very strong theological foundation in our organization and facilitate ongoing theological development. So I just brought some materials with me. In 2018, we celebrated our Jubilee, and as a result, we published this booklet on Bible study, 50 Bible.
Put it in front of your screen so people can see it as well.
Sorry. Sorry.
I'm going to do this, Sas. You're talking this way, so that way they can see you talking to the
That's
screen.
good.
There we go.
Yes.
Go talk this way.
Yes, that is easier. In any case, so I brought a few copies of this Bible study guide, 50 Bible studies on poverty and justice that Tearfund published in 2018. Actually, I have a Bible study myself in this booklet after my brother cycled into the back of a stationary truck and broke his neck, and today he's paralyzed from his shoulders downwards. A whole challenge of how do we support people theologically who are living with disabilities. So I hope this would be of value to you. There are a few other things that I will also share later. Good, to start with, sorry, if I can start sharing my screen. I'm not...
just have the green button down below.
Yes, I'm not very technical orientated.
That's good. Excellent.
Yeah, there, almost there.
Do you want to put it on play?
Maximum.
Can you put it down on play at the bottom?
This one, yeah.
There you go.
That's
Nice.
nice. That's
There we go.
perfect. Perfect.
Good. Just one. Just want to minimize it. Good. So I just revised my topic, my theme a little bit to an assessment of CCMP training at theological institutions in Africa, and you will understand why I've decided to do that. So just to start with a bit of my own personal history, I studied for 4 years theology, preparing for church ministry, starting with a BA in theology, and then a BD, and then a MA or in theology or an MDiv, and then moving on to a DD, as I'm calling myself now, a dumb donkey. Especially around the socio-economic crisis in Africa and the role of the church in addressing that problem. But despite all the 14 years of theological training, nothing prepared me when I started getting involved in ministry in the University of Pretoria, my own city, or in the northern parts of Namibia, or in Alexandra town in the formal settlement area in the middle of Johannesburg in South Africa. So the theology was good, but the practical training was non-existent, so to speak. So that started a journey of, as I said, my doctorate helped me to get an understanding of theological aspects of church and community engagement, but he didn't prepare me practically for that ministry. So therefore, my wife at one point, when I became quite discouraged and disillusioned, she said, "Sas, why don't you do a certificate in participatory community development to prepare yourself for community engagement?" So that is what I've done at the University of South Africa. But my question was, why should I have done a secular course in community development? Why couldn't it have been integrated into my own studies during my theology years? So a dream started to emerge to integrate that kind of training into theological education, at least in South Africa. That led me along different lines and along different paths. But 8 years ago, I got involved in Tearfund, and Tearfund started focusing on a specific process called the church and community mobilization process, through which church leaders are equipped to minister in their communities. And for me, that was like a dream coming true. And my question then was, how could CCMP training be provided through theological institutions in Africa to equip church leaders better for ministry in their communities? So for me, the starting point is, for what and how do we equip church leaders for? And this is quite a good picture of actually Haiti. The overseas missionary come and tell the people with the Bible, come to faith in Christ, etc. But they think about housing, about the meals, health, etc. So there is a disconnect between the missionary or the theologian and what the community actually needs. And therefore, quite often, the people in the community, they might come to faith with the hope that this missionary will provide in housing, in their basic needs. But as we look at theological education in general, what we are training people for is to teach and preach and share the gospel, but not necessarily to meet the needs of the people we are coming in contact with. So are we equipping church leaders for contextual theological engagement in their communities? That was my question. So how can we better equip church leaders for contextual ministry? A person who made a very big impact on me, on my own thinking in this area, is Dr. Antoine Rutjasiri of Rwanda. Quite a remarkable man. He was working with IFES in Rwanda during the genocide, and they literally came just to his road. That is where the genocide stopped. And through his experience in the context of Rwanda, he wrote a very good doctorate thesis on designing a model of leadership development for missional pastors in the Anglican Church. And he says, we have to equip pastors to, number one, exegete the Bible and their communities, and equip believers to be agents of change who can plan interventions that will lead to the transformation of the community. So for him, it is not only to exegete the Bible, but also to exegete communities. And based on that mutual exegesis, to equip believers to become agents of change in communities. And this is exactly what the church and community mobilization process does, which I would then argue that it is really a form of contextual ministry. And just to start with, I brought a number of materials that will help kind of auxiliary resources. That is an overview of the church and community mobilization process. This is a Tearfund understanding of poverty. I will refer to that. And then this booklet explains how the church can get involved in communities. I will refer to these booklets. Unfortunately, I cannot go deep into the different aspects of that. Just quickly, CCMP is a Bible study-based process to facilitate whole life transformation in communities, in churches and communities. It has been developed in Africa around about 2001 by African leaders for Africa as a church-facilitated participatory community development process. So not secular practitioners lead and facilitate this process, but actually church leaders. And it is facilitated by grassroots Christian leaders who are equipped with theological and facilitation skills to facilitate that process in the community. And it is driven by a theology of integral mission and based on restoring of broken relationships with God, others, the self, and the environment. And you will read more about this, the way that Tearfund understands poverty. So the restoration of broken relationships is really the theological foundation of CCMP. I cannot go too deep into that, but in essence, there's a broken, because of the fall, there is a broken relationship with God, ourselves, others, and the environment, and then Jesus came to restore those broken relationships. But quite often we focus only on the relationship with God, and not on the relationship with ourselves, others, and the environment. And that is where poverty became kind of institutional, because we focus just on that relationship with God. That's why the church actually becomes irrelevant in communities. So the emphasis of CCMP is to restore all four relationships and not only the relationship with God. Just some of the CCMP basics then. CCMP helps the church build relationships with the immediate community and work together with the community to address common needs. And for me, this was a big shift as I engaged more in CCMP. Quite often, the approach of the church is to do things for a community, a charitable approach. So we would start soup kitchens, or we distribute things, etc., but not very often engage with the community to identify the needs and work with them to address those needs with local resources. For me, this was a quite significant shift from a more charitable approach to community engagement to a more holistic engagement. CCMP has 5 clear stages that you can read about: the church awakening, description, information gathering, analysis, and decision making. But the church is the beginning point, because we believe quite strongly that God has instituted the church to bring the restoration to those living in poverty in communities. And therefore, the great commandment to go and make disciples of all nations does not only relate to spiritual disciples, but also holistic disciples. And then the church and community will so kind of walk together. So it's really a journey to identify needs and resources to improve their situation holistically. Just a little bit about the background of CCMP training at theological institutions in Africa. CCMP has now been facilitated in around about 4,000 churches in 30 African countries. Tearfund have been supporting CCMP training at a number of theological institutions in Africa since 2014. The reason for that being is because we realized the importance of theological education and the training of church leaders as an integrated part of the life of the church. So in essence, unless we change the theology of the church, we might not necessarily change the life of the church. And I will come back to that just now. There were also questions about the kind of CCMP training at the theological institutions, the quality of CCMP training, the impact of CCMP training, and the introducing CCMP training to more theological institutions. So we decided to do a review of CCMP training at 11 theological institutions in 8 African countries. Because of the nature, we actually had 2 reports in the end between Francophone and Anglophone Lusophone countries. So I just want to review quickly the findings of this report, which I think is quite important also as I assess that. Firstly, and I quote from the reviewer, he said CCMP training is revolutionizing theological training, as well as the life of leaders at theological institutions. So it has a tremendous impact on theological training and institutions where it is provided. CCMP is a tool par excellence to equip churches to play the role of salt and light in the transformation of society. So at all 11 theological institutions all provide CCMP specific training. 6 of the 11 institutions offer CCMP training as part of the theological curriculum and certify the training. I will come back to this. 5 of the institutions deemed CCMP a core course, though there is a problem with accreditation, which I will come back to as well. Number 6, at 2 of the institutions, CCMP is integrated in the diploma degree curricula of the university's Faculty of Theology. The majority of theological institutions, that CCMP have not been integrated fully into the degree programs. Quite encouraging, qualified CCMP lecturers teach and supervise CCMP. At the 8 institutions, CCMP is taught periodically, like other theological courses, so that students do not regard it as an excessive workload. So in other words, it is integrated but not certified. That was and standardized. That was the big problem. Just a little bit of overview of the impact around community development. There is evidence of institutions that are involved and participation in community development, either directly or through students. There's practicals of students at the institutions. Communities are directly involved in the initiated projects, so it bridges the gap from theological institutions to community very clearly. At all the 11 institutions, they adapted CCMP training to according to the different contexts. And then very encouraging to me, the various institutions excel in training facilitators, coaches, and trainers, as reflected in workshops, seminars, and conferences. So it is really, in most of the institutions, CCMP training had been integrated into the life of the institution. And for me, this is the key. Holistic transformation is taking place in the communities where CCMP training is provided, then at different paces, depending on the stages of the CCMP training. So, in short, CCMP training has clearly a major impact on both institutions and the communities where the students are trained. But there are also a number of concerns that for me, I think show a broader challenge to theological education in Africa in particular. Firstly, CCMP is seen as a practical form of training and not theological training. So therefore, there are questions about the theological and academic foundations of CCMP training at the theological institutions. Very interesting. The review recognized or identified the dichotomy between theology and practice as a key barrier actually within the theological institutions and to the curriculum. So how can we bridge this gap, this dichotomy between theology and practice in our theological education? Secondly, the holistic understanding of the church's ministry in a community is not part of the philosophy of theological education provided at the institutions. So how can theological education becomes or the curriculum or the curricula of the institutions become much more realistic, but also the philosophical foundations of theological education? How can there be a shift towards a more realistic form of education? Lack of support of training the training by leaders of the theological institutions. So what they found is that quite often the church leaders wanted to see a more realistic form of training, but not necessarily the leaders of the theological institutions. They wanted to have a much more academic focused form of training. And then a limited understanding of integral mission and CCMP means that quite often the denomination leaders didn't want their students to be trained in CCMP. And then there was also a problem with follow-up. So some of the recommendations then, CCMP should make a transition from more of a practical training program to a more academic program. And this is a real challenge. How do you develop or how do you provide training in a more practical program at an academic institution? Sometimes it feels as if it is a circle that you want to force into a square. So I think what came out of the review is that this is a broader challenge for theological education and institutions. So CCMP should become a major course at the theological institutions. Another recommendation, and I quote, African Theological Associations, institutions, governing bodies, and churches should engage in a campaign of decolonizing Africans from the dichotomous thinking, so that the practice of CCMP receives no opposition at the continental level. So there is a feeling that this dichotomy is entrenched in the church. So how can we decolonize actually towards, how can we move theological education in Africa to a much more African form of theological education in which CCMP can be provided as well? And then there was a very strong call to harmonize understanding of CCMP more practically related to that. Further research is needed. Theological institutions to provide CCMP courses in a wide range of options. And then finally, to develop platforms and networks for sharing CCMP best practice. So this review had been done had been finished in July last year. The question was what next? So we decided to organize a number of workshops on CCMP training at theological institutions in the 8 regional countries of the Southern and East Africa region of Tearfund. So these countries are Zambia, Zimbabwe, Angola, Mozambique, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, what else? I think Malawi. In the end, we facilitated 7 workshops on CCMP training at theological institutions between December 21 and March 2022. And what surprised us is the interest. In the end, 160 theological leaders from more than 70 theological institutions participated in those workshops. And there was broad agreement about the value of CCMP training at theological institutions, but recognizing that it needs to be adapted in different contexts. Working groups have been formed to take this process further, and then 23 leaders came together in September this year at St. Paul's University to review CCMP training at theological institutions and respond to the recommendations mentioned in the review. So this is just the follow-up. This is the consultation in Uganda, in the center of Uganda. This is the consultation that we had in September in Limuru. And what really encouraged us was one of the theological institutions in Kenya actually started formalizing their whole curricula around CCMP training. So CCMP is now the driving force, is now the framework for their curricula. During our consultation in September, what really encouraged me was that finally we got some pathways for CCMP training at theological institutions. The first one is for CCMP training to become a standalone course as a professional qualification. And Tom, this is quite interesting after our discussion over lunch, that perhaps we must look at a training program such as CCMP more as a professional qualification than an academic qualification, as what medical doctors do, for example. So is it possible to offer them a variety of these professional qualifications, either as part of theological training or after students have finished? So more specialist schools separated from the rest of the curriculum. And then mainstreamed, so to develop CCMP training actually as a framework for different certificate, diploma, and degree programs, with the CCMP as specialization. For example, we have been thinking of about the diploma in theology or a BA in theology with diploma in theology with CCMP specialization, or a BA in theology with CCMP specialization. The third a pathway is for students to do CCMP training as they required practical training at the institutions. This is happening at St. Paul's University in Limuru, where all students are required to do CCMP training as their practical training. And 12 institutions are accredited through St. Paul's University, at least 12 theological institutions in Kenya must now provide CCMP training as their practical training programs. And the fourth possibility is for CCMP training to be developed as a TE course that we are busy looking at. Just a brief assessment. CCMP training has an impact on various stakeholders in theological education in Africa. It is clearly an effective form of holistic and contextual ministry training. There is great interest in providing CCMP training through theological institutions in Africa. We have made progress in looking and developing those pathways for CCMP training. But there are still a few challenges denominations and churches should recognize the importance of CCMP training more. The collaboration between theological institutions and denominations to integrate CCMP principles into the theology and life of the denominations and churches, so that it is not just the practice, but it influences also the theology and vice versa. And then CCMP training has to be adapted into different contexts, and more work is needed to balance theology and practice in CCMP training. Just want to go back quickly. And then very important, the training of theological educators as CCMP facilitators. So this is a broad overview of what I've been involved with the past 6 years to see how we can integrate CCMP training as a practical way of theological training into the curriculum or the curricula of theological institutions in Africa. We have done a review that provides clear direction for us, and some of our other colleagues are now taking it further. So just a few questions then. Firstly, what do you think about the concept of church and community mobilization process, CCMP, as explained in this booklet and that booklet? And then how could CCMP be used in churches, denominations, and theological institutions? How could CCMP training specifically be provided at the theological institutions that you are connected with? And then how should the curriculum of theological institutions be adapted to accommodate CCMP training? So this was more than a mouthful.
Yeah, no, that's good.
From
Yeah, let me start off with questions. If you want to ask questions online, then just go down to the reaction button. And then you push on that and it'll say raise hand. So if you do that, then we'll see your hand online. And for those here in building ask questions. You know, I just got through the ISEC conference. And we were talking a lot about accreditation and accrediting formal and non-formal programs. Who was your accrediting group that was looking at the program and assessing?
Yes, so that was one of our main challenges the past 6 years. The Global University for Lifelong Learning, GAL. I don't know whether you. So what they specialize in lifelong learning, and they have developed a whole process to accredit that. But the problem is they are not a recognized university. So that was a big barrier for us. They developed very good pathways for people to get the practical skills. But we made a decision actually at that consultation in September to approach St. Paul's University's Department for Lifelong Learning to accredit, to provide the professional qualifications.
So St. Paul's offers accrediting?
That is part of the discussion now.
Yeah, but
Yes.
they generally do another program.
Yes,
So they're
yes, so
accredited.
through their lifelong learning,
Okay.
Institute for Lifelong Learning.
Yeah, thank you for your lectures. Give us some insight of what CCMP is about. I mean, OCMS has been advocating this for decades.
Yes.
Decades, and it's good to see that we are getting to the place where we think theological education is important, not just providing para-church work, you know, you actually educate the pastor so the pastor can motivate the church members to do something to transform the local community. But my question is, can you give us some examples of what is certain specific churches or church leaders who manage to motivate the church members and work with the community to have some I don't know, a new farming project or something like that.
Yeah.
So give us a taste. And when this kind of things is involved, money is involved. So how do we handle the issue of money as well?
So thanks, Damon. One of the most inspiring stories of CCMP is the pastor in Zambia who shared his own experience. Was with a denomination, and the denomination sent him to a church in a very rural part of Zambia. I think around about 15 people in the church, in a room in a school. So how his question was, how can the 15 people provide in his needs, support him as a pastor? So then his denomination sent him for CCMP training. And where his eyes went open when he realized that God has given him as a person resources to provide in his own need. And God has given the church resources to provide in their need. So the question for him was, what are his resources? And then he realized that he has a plot of land. And he started growing vegetables and selling it. And then it started producing so many vegetables that the church members needed to become involved. And they realized that they have plots of land as well that they can cultivate. So out of that church, a whole kind of improved farming developed. As a result, the church grew from 15 members. They became 50 members. The classroom was not small, was too small, so they moved out, got a building, planted 3 other churches, supporting the pastor totally. So the mindset, CCMP is really about the mindset change that God has given without any money, without any outside resources. So CCMP is really a process to help people discover that God has given them resources to meet their own needs, and as we say, reach their full God-given potential. And if where communities make that shift, that is where and realizing that instead of looking at America for money, God has given them the resources to provide in their own need. One of them, I must actually show you, I can send this to you. One of the most remarkable examples for me of individual transformation is of a lady in Rwanda. You must see her. She is totally disabled. Her legs are like this. And she became part of the CCMP process in a church in Rwanda, going through the different Bible studies. And at one point, they came to the Bible study of the widow's oil with Elisha. And the question was, what oil has God given you? What are the gifts that God has given you to use and multiply? And this, they started talking, and then this lady said, well, I have oil. My mother told me how to weave carpets when I was young. And I actually can weave carpets very well. So she started, and then they said, well, let us work together, put some money together in this group of women in the rural Rwanda. And they bought some materials for this lady, and she started weaving carpets so well that she started developing a business, employing 10 people as a result, sending her son to school. You must see just the before and after photos of the individual transformation, and with this lady, it's a society might have thought this lady has nothing. This lady is reaching her, not only providing in her own need, but also in the needs of others. So that is the kind of transformation that we see.
It's a shift of attitudes from an attitude of dependency
Yes.
to an attitude of not independence, but the capacity to do something with the God-given resources. It's a mental shift.
Yes, it's a mental shift. Yeah. So therefore, we believe if you go through this book, Understanding Poverty, poverty is not about material lack of material resources. It is actually about how our relationship with ourselves, with God, others, and the environment. And where, because the danger is that the church focused only on the relationship with God, that it neglected the relationship with the self. And for me, as an African, that is a key challenge for the church in Africa. How can a church work with communities and people to restore those multiple relationships, not just the relationship with God?
Yes.
Thank you. I come from South Sudan, but spent 50% of my time in Uganda. And I went to Christian University Mukono. I don't know if you,
Yes.
I was very inquisitive to know which institutions you're working with in Uganda. Because when I was in UCU, and that was almost 20 years ago, I mean, the model you're talking about was almost already adopted by UCU. That's Uganda Christian University Mukono. At UCU, they were open to the theologians being introduced to a number of disciplines. And actually, even it is common to find in UCU, for example, someone being trained as a pastor, as a theologian, but with community work.
Yes.
Divinity with the community work, divinity with urban planning, divinity with something. And that's because of the recognition that divinity itself, and I'm using a very crude language, is very dry.
Yes.
And so the pastor also needs to learn other skills. So I'm wondering whether that resistance has come from other denominations, because I know the Catholic Church is very, very strong and very, I mean, sorry to use again the word conservative when it comes to theological issues. But my impression in Uganda, as far as the other evangelical and the Anglican churches are concerned, that should not be much really a big problem. But here's my question. You said earlier that one of the core things is really to exegete the community.
Yes.
I wonder how far you went in that, in designing your program. Because really, there's so much that's happening in the community.
Yes.
And I don't really mean to be very rude here, but really what you're saying here is actually what the communities are doing in Africa.
Yeah.
African communities are communitarian, and they build on issues to do with the community and working together.
Yes. Yes.
So I just want to know whether you had done some background study to understand the philosophy, because you said philosophy was missed.
Yes.
But whether you understood the philosophy of the African community.
Exactly. Yes.
So that then these can factor in using contextual examples.
Yes.
Now something being seen as being not transferred from Europe. And then you're telling us the obvious. Maybe that's why maybe some people might think there is nothing new and therefore resistance comes in. So anyway, the question is, did you look at the local practices and integrate them into your program?
Yes. So firstly about Uganda, Bishop Lee Theological College in north of Soroti. They're an Anglican theological college, and they started providing CCMP training a few years ago. I think the challenge with community development, which is offered as addition to or together separate from theological education, is that it is not integrated theologically into the theological training. That is what we have seen at a number of Christian universities and theological institutions, where it is theology plus community development. What the CCMP does is it integrates. So that is the difference. So it is in essence, if you look at just on this booklet, page 11, then what is it now? Just want to get it. Yes, page 11. So there are certain this booklet.
This,
Yes, page 11. There are certain principles that we have identified for church and community transformation, to see church and community transformation, of which CCMP is one approach. You can read more about it in this booklet. Firstly, it is driven by a biblical theology of integral mission. And in the Catholic Church, yes, around Catholic social teaching, that is more integrated. That is more prominent. But in general, our theology, and especially the evangelical community, it is not more focusing on spiritual mission instead of a holistic form of mission. And then restoring the four broken relationships. As I said, it is about biblical reflection and mindset change. And again, the biblical reflection facilitates the mindset change. This is the manual that we are using. And I will leave 2 copies of the manual so that you can have a look at it. But it is based on Bible study. And then the focus is on the church as the agent of holistic change. It is not a community development worker. It is really the church at the heart of community change. But then using approaches from the developmental world. So, for example, inclusive participatory approaches to bring about change. So, what the way that I see the benefit of CCMP training, and then just the emphasis on local resources. The benefit of this process is it is much more theologically integrated, though in need of better theological foundation. But it is much more integrated into the theology and life of the church than what I've seen with other approaches. And the danger then that you teach people theology and something else instead of integrating that. Secondly, about what you said about Africa, I totally agree with you about understanding the community. The process developed out of Africa. This is not Kenyan leaders saw some of the participatory community development processes from within Africa, and then they adapted it and they developed the church and community mobilization process. Using some knowledge, some tools in the local community to identify the needs and resources in the community, but because even in communities, the emphasis is not always on restoring the four broken relationships, and holistically. So quite often we say, I restore my relationship with God, and then with myself, and then with others, and then with the environment. So it is much more integrated. And I think, at least in some of the communities that I've been involved with, that theological approach is neglected also when identifying needs and resources in the community. So I have a very interesting discussion, but thank you very much for that.
In terms of the training, Sas, is it largely formal or informal, given those kind of broad differences?
So this is also interesting. CCMP training is in essence informal training.
Would you call it non-formal?
Yeah, more non-formal.
Because that's the term that they were using.
Yeah, it's more non-formal. Excuse me, not. so the question that we have, and only at our consultation being really addressed, is how do you facilitate non-formal
Exactly.
training
Yeah.
through formal
Yeah.
institutions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Uh,
How did you negotiate?
That's a big question.
yeah,
Big question.
and that was why it was a real eye-opener for us. When we realized it could be done through the institution for lifelong learning. So that was a real aha moment, yes. And perhaps where many Christian universities, not just Christian universities, other secular universities as well, have institutes for lifelong learning. I think that is that could be the way to bring non-formal training more into more formalized training with accreditation.
Did you hand out like completion of course documents? Or,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is now part of one of the discussion points with St. Paul's, that they will accredit the CCMP training as a professional qualification, and then provide a certificate.
And that would then provide a bona fide if you're applying to another program that you had.
Yes, that you have done.
An accredited.
Yes.
Yeah. But either way, I see it going to be offered, like, I mean, as an additional kind of discipline, because my understanding of integration, I mean, you can integrate things from different sources.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be specifically in the curriculum of the theology. As long as within the culture of the university, that is part of the package that you go with home, I'm okay with that in terms of integration. But I understand where you're coming from. You would like to see that really in the curriculum of the, and then it's part of the philosophy.
Yes.
Yeah, but what else practically? I can go and learn, I mean, community work as a pastor, and I get the same principles that I can apply. But one way also would be to try to see if that could be offered as a preparatory course, something like that. I mean, a course that is part, I mean, there are universities that offer certain courses that may not really be the core, but then everybody must go through those courses compulsory.
Yeah.
For example, in Christian University, I mean, in Mukono, I went for education.
Yeah.
But all of us had to do NT, New Testament, Old Testament. Whether you're doing engineering, whether law, whatever you must do, New Testament and Old Testament. Comparison. Yeah, so maybe it could be introduced as one of the
and I think what has kind of become clear is that you need to have different focus. So you need to have people who are kind of professionals in CCMP, therefore the professional qualification. But because of this need for holistic ministerial training, our question was also then how can CCMP be offered as a required course for ministerial training? Just one example where this is being done already is through the what is it, IECA? It is the Evangelical Congregational Church in Angola. They have a seminar. All their pastors, ministers are trained through Emmanuel Seminary, and all students are in the denomination must now do CCMP training before they can qualify as ministers. So this is one example of where CCMP has been totally integrated into that theological institution and the denomination, because quite often the denominations require students to do, or institutions to train their students in certain ways. At St. Paul's, they have integrated it now into the practical training of all students. So all students graduate or doing their diploma or graduate courses at St. Paul's must do CCMP training. The difficulty with
as a course unit?
Excuse me?
As a course unit?
Yes, as a course unit. The challenge is CCMP training or CCMP is really a long-term process. 3 years to go through, with a congregation through this process.
Over to you, Nadia, you have a question?
Good morning, everyone. Greetings from Mexico City. Hi, Sas. How are you?
Hi, Nadia.
Yes, thank you for sharing. It's very insightful and encouraging to hear what you're doing and all the new ideas that you have. I was wondering, in your analysis of the situation, you've identified big themes and big needs. I was wondering, what do you perceive as still being in tension as you move forward? Yeah, what are the roadblocks that you perceive are still in the way to move in this direction?
So my own view is it would be interesting to hear my African friends. The longer I became involved in this process, in theological education in Africa, the more I realized how westernized it is.
Yeah.
In essence, if you look at theological education as we have it, as it is provided, it is really a German and middle-class English British system. From the gymnasium or here in Oxford. So how focusing on the academic work, the theory, but neglecting the practical training. And the missionaries who went to Africa had been trained through in this Western system, and they took that Western system and transplanted into Africa. And what my friend from South Sudan said about the communal life in Africa, this is actually going, this training is very individualistic, it is very theoretical, it is dichotomizing life instead of integrating life. So moving forward, a key question is actually for theological education in Africa as a whole is how can we decolonize theological education in Africa? Is it, I actually wrote a paper, if I can just share that quickly, and I will send my my presentation, that we can distribute it. But I wrote a chapter for a book on theological education in Africa that goes a little bit deeper into some of the challenges to theological education in Africa. And the big question, oh yes, what I wanted to say is there are different ways to address this dichotomy. So, for example, do we teach CCMP or integral mission as part of missiology? But our subjects are, in essence, already divided. So you have New Testament, Old Testament, systematic theology, practical theology, etc., separated from each other, and then never mind the other disciplines. So a key question for us is how can we develop a real African way of theological education, getting rid of the legacy of colonial education. And some of, I don't know whether you know Dr. John Jusu, he's now a professor at Africa International University in Kenya. He argues that we need to get rid of all these subjects and to teach more thematic subjects. So approach theological education more thematically. from need in the community. So teach how to respond to the disasters, but theologically. And then you might have a course on disaster response, or on gender, or on health, or whatever. And these become your courses instead of the New Testament, and then New Testament, Old Testament, practical theology, etc., systematic theology. You integrate into those thematic areas. So I think this is a big question for my African theological friends. I think one of the reasons why I realized I couldn't continue in my role as a theology and networking engagement manager, because I sit here in the UK. I'm African, but still I'm not, forgive me, I'm not a black African. So it is really our African theological leaders need to take this quest forward of how can we develop a real African form of theological education stripped of its Western legacy.
Good, okay.
Yeah. Actually, my question you almost answered, because I saw the word decolonizing on one of your slides.
Yes.
So, for someone who lived in a colony before, I was born in Hong Kong. So you really need to understand the mindset
Exactly.
of someone who living under the government, who's a colonial government. And so say, for example, the school that I went to, the headmaster is from Scotland.
Yes.
And many teachers are Western people, British, Australian. And what they tell you, you do.
Yes.
You don't question, yeah? You'll be in trouble if you. So we are trained the mindset. What Western people tells you,
Yes.
you do.
Yeah.
You don't change, you don't question, or else you get into trouble.
Um,
So you apply the same thing to theological education. The missionary taught us this. We change this, we can get in trouble. Right? So the Savior thinks it's not to change things, yeah?
Yeah.
But I think there's reach a point where we have a moment of awakening and saying, well, God has given us theological resources.
Yeah.
God has given us the intellectual resources. God has given us the physical resources, land and everything. We can actually do something creative. It's that moment of awakening that we can actually do it without following the straitjacket pattern. That is a change of mindset that can change many things. But that's to do with decolonization.
Yeah. But I must say I'm quite encouraged. In 2021, last year in November, we actually got we organized together with the different networks of theological institutions in Africa a consultation on theological education in Africa from the perspective of the African Union's vision for Africa. And I think we were 2 or 3 Westerners. And for me, we started making real progress to start thinking of how to develop a practical, a real African form of theological education. The problem is most resources are still written from Africa. I just want to add this as well. Not only that, but also to understand, to read and apply the Bible from an African perspective. I think you would know about Professor Desmburu's work around African hermeneutics. And I was involved in a number of publications where it was really difficult for African leaders to understand and apply the Bible in their own context. Because everything is written from the West, that is being taught. And then secondly, also, so the material, but the students, the leaders themselves, the theological educators, are trained at Western theological institutions. Praise God for OCMS, but as you know, I don't want to say what you do at Westminster Theological College or some of the other institutions. So how can we, how can we equip the African theological leaders to understand that and apply the Bible from within their own context, getting rid of the European perspectives on hermeneutics.
So I have a question for Richard online. Go ahead and unmute Richard and then we'll.
Yes, Sas, thank you very much for your talk, and I would encourage you in the work that you're doing with introducing CCMP into theological education. I'd have to say I've had the privilege of seeing self-help groups and CCMP at work in both Ethiopia and Haiti. So I would just reflect back that CCMP works well in other communities apart from African communities. And I know it's also worked well in Afghanistan. The strength of CCMP, to me, having seen it, is that once people's basic needs for survival are addressed, they're much more open to spiritual questions, and that has led in many areas to growth in the church. And the problem is to help pastors understand that they can't do it all, but actually they need the body of the church to be engaged in this and doing it. So that's really a comment. You mentioned harmonization, and I know that World Relief have a similar program, which I think was birthed in Rwanda, of village and loans associations, which is slightly broader than the CCMP approach. And I wondered if you could comment on any comparisons between the two and how you would kind of pick the best of both to go forward in terms of education. And my second question is, you've talked about introducing CCMP into theological education in Central and Southern Africa. What about in other parts of the world, South America, Asia, the East? So those are my two questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Richard. So my focus the past 6 years had been very much on Africa, because this was my role. But in this booklet on church and community transformation, there are other examples from elsewhere in the world as well. If you can just see this one, in my presentation slides, there are links to the booklets that you can download. I totally agree with you that CCMP is not the only approach to facilitate church and community transformation. As you mentioned, World Relief, for example, their church empowerment zones, the Samaritan Strategy Africa, that I respect quite highly, they deal much more with worldview change. So there are other models that we started actually engaging with, also from a Tearfund perspective. But again, on page 11 of this booklet, in all these models, you can see that there are, in essence, 6 principles, as I've mentioned. The first around the biblical theology of integral mission, then restoring broken relationships, and then mindset change, the church at the center of holistic change, and then the participatory approaches. What is interesting, as you mentioned the self-help groups, as these processes are catalyzed in communities, the communities themselves then decide how to move that forward. For example, in some cases, it develops into self-help groups, then they would require further training in specific areas, for example, around environmental concerns and issues. In microfinance training, we have developed a very good link with with the trauma center in the US to provide micro loan training to integrate that into CCMP. So a number of as the CCMP grows and the build-up in communities, there are additional links to further training and maximizing the resources to meet the need in community. What is also just interesting, if I can refer to that, Tearfund has looked at what is the transformation that we want to see in communities. And if you go to page 29, we developed the light wheel as to look at what is the transformation that we would like to see in community. And you would be able to see how some of the other programs connect into that. For example, emotional and mental well-being, physical health, capability, material assets and resources, care for the environment, participation in the community, social connections and personal relationships, and then living faith actually integrated in all of these areas. So I think this is what we realize is how living faith impacts all areas of our engagement in the community. Just in terms of your, so I thought that this could be helpful. As I said, there is a link to the in the slides. We have done the CCMP review in across Africa, actually. So not only in Anglophone Southern and East Africa, but also in Chad and DRC, in Francophone Africa. What we didn't realize is how different educational systems are in Francophone and Anglophone Lusophone Africa. So in Francophone Africa, a different kind of journey developed. We got connected with, we started working with the network of theological institutions in Francophone Africa called CETAF. CETAF worked with Tearfund in developing an integral mission curriculum, kind of next to, as part of the theological curricula, but next to other subject areas. And they have published 7 books or 6 books around various areas of integral mission, including the CCMP. And these books have been finally published last year. And the intention, the first theological educators are trained in teaching this integral mission curriculum, which is now being implemented across all the CETAF related institutions. There are a few hundred of them, or more than 100. And this will become required integration in the CETAF accredited curriculum.
Manjewa, please unmute and ask your question. Hey, you're still muted. Go ahead and unmute. Still muted. Let me just check. I'm gonna maybe turn up your microphone or write your question in the chat.
No.
Can't hear you. Try writing your message in the chat.
He's not muted.
I know it's not muted here, but there's something does sound. Can you write it on the chat and then I'll ask the question?
Yeah.
Here's a question while he's writing that in, from Nestor. In what way do you perceive communities transformation? Does it include global problems?
Yes.
Particularly global economics that is ruling and running the world? Does your transformation include the intention to challenge the power or alter the system?
That's a big one. Is I must actually sing.
Good question.
Yeah, so the way that we see transformation needs to happen on a local level. So the restoration of relationships on a local level, on a personal level, but also a community level and the local level. But as you correctly recognize, some of these issues are governmental orientated, or systemic orientated, etc. So Tearfund has developed a very strong focus around advocacy and campaigning. And what we have done is to equip local leaders through the church, through CCMP in local advocacy to address those systemic problems, in more structural problems in the community. And it is quite remarkable what has happened. But also then recognizing that some of these issues are global in orientation. There are global power structures that we cannot address on our own, but which the church as God, because the church is at the heart of our work. So equipping the church to engage in those global structural issues around economic power, around the environment, Tearfund is quite strongly on. And actually, I forgot. I will give this out as well. We just finished a theology of environmental and economic sustainability. So, how do we address these big global economic and environmental issues theologically? And there's a link in the, or I can send the link how we see the church can engage with that. But as part of our expanded CCMP work, we train local communities in local advocacy to address those structural issues in the local community.
A question from Martin Chewa. In theological institutions with established curriculum, how easy or difficult has it been to integrate the CCP?
Very
difficult. Very easy.
Very difficult.
Very difficult.
I think because as I've explained, the legacy, the colonial legacy of theological education, I think that's a bigger problem, but perhaps more long term as well. Where we have seen a change and where it was easier was with a curricula review. So when theological institutions review their curricula, that was the point of facilitating change, etc. Where we have also seen quite dramatic, or the greatest progress is where there have been a change in the denominations. Where the denominations, for example, the Anglican Church in Kenya, said, we want our students to be trained in CCMP.
Yeah.
St. Paul's, you find a way to do that.
Yeah, I've got another question here, and this has to do with public universities, right? And I suppose in Africa. So I'm just going to assume that. How can CCP be offered in a department of religion in a public university? Is that possible? And if so, has it been done?
Very good question. Challenge to my colleagues now who are working on this. Our focus had been on theological institutions because that is where the ministers of the church in Africa are mainly trained. Yeah. Although, where the public university, where there had been a link with the public universities, had been with increasingly some of the quality standards, required by institutions or by country, where I think there's a real opening coming from our consultation in 2021. There was a real commitment around engaging with Agenda 20, with the aspirations of Agenda 2063 as the vision of the African Union for Africa. And that the public university, the religious studies departments of the public universities are very included in that process. For example, there was a commitment by participants to engage with Agenda 2063 as their core within their core curricula. And for me, the aspirations explained in Agenda 2063 relates directly to CCMP, to some of the principles in CCMP. So from that perspective, I think we will see a greater engagement from the public university, perhaps not directly through CCMP, but in another way.
You mentioned 2063. That
Yes.
is year 2063.
That's right.
Why is it 40 years away?
Actually, the Agenda 2063 had been adopted by the African Union in 2013 as their 50-year plan.
I see.
Yes, to see a change.
Very long term.
Very long term.
Half a century.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's how we like to think of that. So,
Someone was saying that you can even plan for 100 years. You can have a 100-year plan.
But I don't know, hopefully before then we will see a shift. We will see the decolonization of theological education in Africa.
Jesus, couldn't have- All right, well, thank you, Sas, and thank you for all the good questions that were asked. Again, this can be seen on YouTube. And again, I'm very appreciative of Sas for coming in and sharing this lecture. Next week, we'll have Fanen Ade from Nigeria, who will be speaking, and look forward to his lecturing at OCMS.
This thesis was on development.
Yeah, it'll be very good. All right, so with that, we will bid adieu. And thank you very
Thank you very much. I hope it was useful.
It was very useful.